Hello, and welcome to the podcast that tries to answer one simple question. What is this thing called film noir? I'm your host, Sergio Angelini, and welcome to Tipping My Fedora, where we discuss movies, books, TV, radio, and much more besides, all from the darker side of the street. In the 1970s, a turbulent and financially unstable decade defined by the rise of terrorism and stagflation, noir cinema seemed to subdivide into two camps. Nostalgic works recreating the cinema of the 1940s and 50s, often typed as retro-noir, and tougher, more despairing examples of neo-noir that were steeped in doom and gloom, exuding nihilism and mistrust at every turn. Film noir was a term that was only just emerging in American critical circles, but already looked like its heyday had passed, and that, going forward, it would never be the same again. One of the key releases of that time was Michael Winner's 1974 box office smash, Death Wish, starring Charles Bronson as a man driven to murderous reprisals after a violent assault that left his wife dead and their daughter an emotional wreck. Adapted from the 1972 novel by Brian Garfield, it crystallised an emerging trend of films featuring disillusioned individuals who turn to violence as a way to deal with the chaos in which they find themselves. Joining me to discuss this seminal and highly controversial work is Simon Brown, an independent scholar who specialises in early film history, horror, adaptation studies and film technology. He's the author of Cecil Hepworth and the Rise of the British Film Industry from the University of Exeter Press, and Screening Stephen King, Adaptation and the Horror Genre in Film and Television from the University of Texas Press. He is also one of my oldest and dearest friends. Simon, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I ask all the newbies on the podcast two icebreaker questions. So the first one is, what would be your definition of film noir?
Which is a tricky question. So from an academic perspective, it's not a genre. For me, it's very much a style. It's a style that emerged from its kind of context within a specific period of time within Hollywood, and then has outgrown that context and has become a sort of style removed from its substance, if you like. So it's a style that can hop different things. You don't need to have necessarily the hardball detective, femme fatale, yada, yada, yada. Although there's a kind of pure version of noir, if you like, that has that, which is an interesting point because I'm going to contradict that later on. But for me, very much it's a style. It's a style. And it's a bit like expressionism, I suppose, in that way. There's a kind of an idea of expressionism which is rooted in a certain period, in a certain type of film, and then it's something that then gets picked up and transported beyond that kind of quite narrow definition. So I would call it a style.
Yeah, I mean, that I think that's great. I think that's how I feel about it as well. If we're kind of trying to boil it down to essentials or not, in terms of a film that kind of did it for you, you know, when you first saw a film that we would call film noir and you thought of it as film noir that had an impact on you, what would that be?
That's a really difficult question because it's sort of it didn't necessarily happen like that. It was an evolution. When I was a teenager, I saw Casablanca for the first time and was very taken by Ingrid Bergman and Humphrey Bogart. And at that time, this would be early 80s, I guess, Warner Brothers had bought out this sort of collection of Bogart movies on VHS in these lovely packaging they were grey covers, I remember. So I started looking at them and, you know, see things like Dark Passage and In a Lonely Place, and I obviously started reading about them. And I think for a while there I kind of associated noir with that kind of story, you know, with Bogart, with Sam Spade, Philip Marlowe, etc., etc. But I think for me the kind of tipping point was, and this must be in the 90s, I guess, seeing a laserdisc of Anthony Mann's T-Men and Raw Deal, which, if I'm not mistaken, was shot by John Alton.
They were.
Yeah. And I remember watching those and going, okay, now I get it. And I think what was brilliant about those two films is that they weren't quote-unquote Hollywood classics. They weren't Bogart, they weren't Barbara Stanwyck, they weren't the sort of Mildred Pierce, those kind of favourites. They were, I don't want to use the word standard because there was nothing standard about them, but they were B movies, they were small, there was not anybody famous in them, I guess, in that kind of similar sort of way. But the style of them just leapt out at you in a way that was truly breathtaking and nice to see, because obviously Laserdisc, back then it was way better than VHS, and you were looking at it going, oh my God, this is good anyway. And that for me really cemented the idea of what film noir was. It sort of coalesced around those two films. And then I think the next one after that pulled it all together was probably Franchot Tone and The Phantom Lady. Is it The Phantom Lady?
Phantom Lady, yeah, which is a fantastic movie. Yeah, Robert Siodmak.
Jack Marlowe, lover of beauty and women, tossed by violent emotions like a straw in a hurricane. Carol, as loyal in love, as relentless in hate as fate itself. Scott Henderson, accused of murder, and his only alibi, a mirage, a phantom lady. Inspector Burgess, who condemned to death a man he knew was innocent. Cliff, a hopped-up drummer who held the key to a crime. Ann Terry, who entered a man's life for one night, then vanished.
Give me a break. What's the difference whether my tie's okay or not?
It makes a great deal of difference, Mr. Henderson.
Yeah? Why?
Your wife was strangled with one of your ties.
And then, at that point, the whole thing kind of comes together. So that goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is it's this sort of style which exists outside of a certain type of narrative with which we associate noir, the sort of double indemnity, femme fatale kind of thing. I think it was watching T-Men and Raw Deal that I realised that the style of noir, that kind of lighting, that urban landscape, that crime milieu was really what it was all about. And I'm sure that many other people that you're going to talk to are going to have a completely different viewpoint on it. But for me, that was what it was. It was those two films I went, oh, I get it now. Absolutely. They are masterpieces. And I still have that Laserdisc, I think.
I wish I could say that. No, yes, DVD and Blu-rays for me. But no, I know exactly what you mean. Yes, I mean, I think with Phantom Lady, I think I have multiple iterations on different formats. But they're all terrific and all quite different films in their own way, of course. One is a sort of semi-documentary style, T-Men, pro-governmental force going out and saving America from itself. Raw Deal is much more personal, with Claire Trevor, terrific in that film. And then Phantom Lady, which of course is this very kind of paranoid, dreamlike or nightmarish scenario from a story by Cornell Woolrich. That in the book is in fact a bit more of a whodunit. But by the time they film it, you know where you are halfway through it. They reveal who the baddie is. And therefore, then it becomes about this exercise in morbid style at one extent, where it's this kind of psychological suspense. And on the other hand, it's the way that you represent the world in this incredible kind of shadowy look, courtesy of Woody Bradell, who makes it look absolutely fantastic.
But this is the thing. I mean, I don't think that film noir is a genre per se, not in the same way that a Western or horror film is, or anything like that, pick your genre, romantic comedy. If we see it as genre adjacent, for want of a better term, the thing about genres is that they always have porous boundaries, right? And there is, at the centre of the Western, for example, a kind of nucleus of classic films that we sort of say are quintessentially what a Western was, Stagecoach, well, John Ford, but My Darling Clementine, etc., etc. And then it bleeds outwards into different directions. It bleeds outward into Peckinpah and then ultimately into Clint Eastwood and Kevin Costner, Sergio Leone, etc., etc. And I think that's very much where my definition of noir comes from. There's like a nucleus that has all of the elements, all of those kind of iconographic and thematic elements that we associate with a core, if you like, core corpus. But then those things get separated out. So is there a femme fatale movie that isn't shot in a noir style? Probably. I can't think of it off the top of my head, but I would imagine there almost certainly is. And then you get these films that don't do the sort of core kind of themes of noir but are very much kind of adopting that style, which I suppose in a way is why we're here talking about a film that most people are going to be scratching their heads going, what are you talking about? What are you talking about this in relation to film noir?
Well, the time has come, so I don't know if the basic question is why Death Wish, but nonetheless, Death Wish was, and we're talking here about the original 1974 film, directed by Michael Winner, written for the screen by Wendell Mays, starring Charles Bronson. And it's a film that was hugely successful at the box office, hugely influential, led to a whole range of revenge films. Quentin Tarantino insists, I suspect correctly, that there probably wouldn't have been Taxi Driver without Death Wish, in the sense that it empowered the studios to think, no, this is a good idea, this has commercial legs, so we'll take a chance on material that is edgy, difficult, but that actually there might genuinely be an audience for it, because we're in the mid-1970s in America and cinema is changing. But on the other hand, you and I both watched it again recently, and this is a film that comes with enormous amounts of baggage. And yet, I think the first reaction we both had was, well, that was better than I remembered, and that was a nice feeling. But it's because, and this is where I suspect for me the noir element comes in, it's a much more personal film than you think it's going to be, in the sense that it's much more about how main protagonist feels, how he changes. Now, perhaps we could talk quickly about the book. It's based on a novel by Brian Garfield that was published in 1972 of the same title. And the main thing that people know about it is that Brian Garfield really didn't like the way that they made the movie in 1974. And yet he knew damn well that for the rest of his life he was always going to be Brian Deathwish Garfield. He was stuck with it the same way that Robert Bloch was going to be stuck with Robert Psycho Bloch. So can you tell us a little bit about the book?
It was kind of fascinating to revisit it, because I read it 40 odd years ago now. So I reread it in preparation for this and really didn't like it at all.
Okay.
The book is way more mean-spirited than the film. Maybe mean-spirited isn't the right phrase. It's very nihilistic in the sense that the main character, who's got a different name in the book, it's still Paul.
It's Paul Benjamin.
Paul Benjamin, yeah. It's his internal. A lot of the film is the book is his internal monologue, as he gradually segues from being a liberal to basically being a Trump supporter. Though not obviously in the book, but, becoming this sort of right-wing, gun-toting, really not very nice guy. And we're not supposed to... I don't think the book is asking us to feel sorry for him. I don't think the book is asking us to see this as a tragic journey at all. I think the way the lead character Paul thinks in the book, there are these sort of vignettes. At one point he's sitting on a train, and this is early on. This is like about page 77, so this isn't even halfway through, I don't think. And he's sitting on a subway, and this is verbatim from the book. He says he was looking from face to face along the rows of crowded passengers, scanning them for signs of redeeming worth. Of the 58 faces he could see, 7 appeared to belong to people who had the right to survive. The rest were fodder. I should have been a Nazi, he thought. And it's like, how are you supposed to react to that? It's like he is seeing himself becoming this person in stages and doesn't mind. And nobody else minds either. So the book ends... Is it okay to spoil the book?
I think so.
Yeah. So the book ends where basically he's out and he sees a bunch of quote-unquote scumbags, kills them all, and then discovers there's a cop on the other side of the street watching. So he freezes, thinking, oh, I've been caught, and the cop takes off his hat and puts it under his arm and turns his back and walks away, and the book comes to an end. And it's all like, this is fine. This is exactly what America needs right now. Vigilantism, no problem at all. There is no counter view in the book. And I think, as is very often the case, when authors have their work adapted, they get very cross about the changes that have been made. But as is also, not always, but often the case, actually the changes that are made do make it better. And I think the film doesn't do the book, and it is to the film's benefit.
It's interesting because the way Garfield has spoken about it is that it was meant to be, in a way, a surprise when he really turns to violence. I think you're supposed to be shocked by that, and it's meant to be something that takes you back. But that equally, the way he envisaged it, I think he was thinking of a more worm that turned story. Now, when you use a phrase like that, of course, in my mind, that makes me think of
the two Ronnies.
Yes, definitely. But also Straw Dogs, which was based on this novel by Gordon Williams called The Siege of Trench's Farm. And he totally hated what Sam Peckinpah did with his book. Slightly with more reason, I suspect, because Peckinpah really changed the book quite substantially.
Okay, you've had your fun. I'll give you one more chance. And if you don't clear out now, there'll be real trouble. I mean it.
This is David Sumner. All his life he's been running away, turning his back on trouble, involvement, and confrontation. Until now.
There are 5 men out there.
I know that.
He took his wife and fled to an English country town.
There was once a time, Mrs. Sumner, when you were ready to beg me for it.
Take your hands off me.
He thought he could find peace and refuge. Instead, he found that a man can't hide forever.
I care. This is where I live. I will not allow violence against this house.
Sam Peckinpah, who uncaged the Wild Bunch, now unleashes Dustin Hoffman in Straw Dogs.
I also think the film is much better than the book. I don't think The Siege of Trench's Farm is a particularly good novel, frankly. Williams later collaborated with Terry Venables and created Hazel, the Private Eye, using a pseudonym, P.B. Ewell. And Williams, nonetheless, never stopped complaining about it. And in fact, in one of the Hazel books, he has the character go into a cinema, and although he doesn't name it, he says he saw this terrible film about this violence in a little cottage, and you know that he's talking about Straw Dogs, and he loathes it. But the point about that one was, of course, is that whether you like that film or you don't, it's very much a story about a kind of New York intellectual, shall we say. It's an academic, played by Dustin Hoffman. So not a kind of traditional action-adventure type figure like Charles Bronson. And he's someone who is pushed and is pushed and is pushed, and then there's this explosion of violence, which the film challenges you to decide, is this okay or is it horrible? In the Death Wish film, it's very much this push and pull about what's civilization and what's the pioneer spirit. And so the little Cornish village is a bit like the Wild West in that sense. It's full of people who don't communicate a lot with modern society, perhaps, and therefore we see this outsider who gets bullied and ridiculed by the locals, but then he's pushed too far. And he tries to do something. He tries to basically protect this weak person who has probably done something terrible, but who is someone who nonetheless deserves help, perhaps rather than just simple revenge. That's what that narrative trajectory is. Do you think do you think the novel's getting anywhere near to that at all, or do you think it's just too unpleasant?
It's interesting because, of course, in the book there's a couple of major differences. One, the character of Paul in the book is a liberal, but is very much this kind of everyman. He's sort of in his 40s, going a bit pudgy. There's a lot of discussion about the weight that he's put on. He's an accountant, and they spend an awful lot of the book. I learnt an awful lot about accounting reading this book, which is quite interesting. I don't know whether Brian Garfield was an accountant, but he seems to be very, very interested in it. But also, the key thing here, I think the difference is that Paul in the book is an insider. He's not an outsider, he's the insider. There's a lot of talk in the book about how he's a born and bred New Yorker. He's never been out of New York, except I mean, obviously he goes to Tucson in the book as he does in the film, with very different results, incidentally. But he is a New Yorker, so what he is the insider who is seeing it all go to shit. Am I allowed to say that?
Well, I guess so.
Yeah. Around him, when in actual fact, there's a big difference between that and the Dustin Hoffman character in Straw Dogs, who's an outsider coming into this Corners village. The idea of the pioneer spirit is always the kind of lone hero, if you like, and who sort of breezes in and cleans up the town. But here he's actually in the town, part of the town, and sort of is trying to kind of clean it up from the inside, which creates a different layer, I think, of meaning. But I don't think the book is asking us to question whether or not what he does is right. It sort of just presents it. And I think maybe it asks you to question it in the comfort of your own living room after you've finished reading it, but it's not part of the narrative, really, in the book, whereas I think it is an integral part of the film.
So let's talk about the film. So in the film, the opening scenes are in fact set in far, far away Hawaii, and it's this kind of prelapsarian Edenic haven. It's just Paul Kersey and his wife, and they're on a holiday, and they're kind of talking about the fact that they're perhaps older than they used to be. They have a grown-up married daughter, after all. But nonetheless, they're enjoying the idea of actually being able to just spend time with each other and away from all the problems. And then one of the things that I think is very amusing is that that's a very quick sequence, after all. It's maybe a couple of minutes. And then all of a sudden, they're on the plane, they're back in New York. It's traffic jams and it's stress and it's angst, and they're back in the city. And whereas before we saw them sort of cheerfully talking to each other and being lovey-dovey, we then cut to them in the taxi and they're sort of quiet and putting up with it because, they're stuck in traffic, they're not talking to each other, which is very amusing, but also sets up very quickly this change in habitat. And certainly it seems to be presenting New York very quickly as a war zone, which in fact is a phrase that's used by, I think it's Paul's boss, because we see them go home, and then he goes to the office in the next scene. And in the office right away, I think it's his friend Sam, who is from the book, right? And he right away sort of says, you know what happened while you were away on holiday? There were this many murders and this many muggings. And, right away you're being, perhaps not very subtly, being told that New York is, as was, I think, the thoughts of lots of people at the time, was that New York was becoming kind of unlivable. There have been strikes on the verge of bankruptcy, and everybody's talked about how you couldn't go through Central Park. It was this dangerous area. And there's this kind of reaction to that. I'm assuming that sort of seems to reflect what's kind of that aspect of the book, I suppose. Oh
yeah, very much so. I mean, the opening of the book is Sam and Paul in a car, basically having exactly the same thing. Right. They're stressed, they're annoyed, they can't get off of Fifth Avenue, blah 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 blah. In terms of the opening of the film, on the one hand, yes, it's not subtle, but on the other hand, it's also economic. The film sets up its premise in about 10 minutes, and then the rest of it is, watching Charles Bronson's character shift and change, which in a way is kind of the point of the film. You have this sort of central section where he starts thinking about this, and then it gets enabled into it, and then this final section where he goes off and does all his vigilante things, and then the emphasis shifts towards the police captain and the kind of the manhunt for him. That's where the kind of moral ambiguity of the tale is entered into the film, which is largely absent in the book. But let's start this off in a way by sort of talking about the casting of Charlie Bronson, because we've already mentioned Dustin Hoffman, and I think you can go through the A-list of stars who all passed on Death Wish. Paul Newman did. I think probably Robert Redford did. I think Henry Fonda was asked to do it, which would have made it into a very different film. And of course, Charles Bronson comes with his own set of his own iconography, his own persona. He is a tough guy. It makes total sense because Winner and Charles Bronson had just come off of making The Mechanic, if I'm not mistaken, or at least had done so.
And The Stone Killer.
Yeah.
And they'd done another film as well.
So they had a wonderful kind of shorthand together. I think that the casting of Bronson, I don't know whether the casting of Bronson impacts on the tone of the film, or whether the casting of Bronson is right for the tone of the film that Michael Winner was going for. But in that film itself, he is the perfect Paul, I think. Because at the beginning, you know, he does act like an everyman. He does act meek and mild. He is a liberal. You know, he objects to what Sam is saying about murderers and muggers and so on and so forth. But he clearly has the potential, just from the way he looks, of this darkness. And it seems to make sense to me, the idea that his journey into darkness, his journey into vigilantism, which seems logical when you think about the idea of it's Charles Bronson, it's what you'd expect, is then counterpointed by this reaction to what he does, which is coming out of the police. And then there are scenes, you know, there are these big kind of magazine covers on billboards all around him about, you know, but in the latter half of the film, all about whether vigilantism is a good or bad thing. I mean, Henry Fonda would have been really interesting, because that would have been, you know, this kind of American icon with those sort of Western connotations, doing this in this sort of nasty, grubby sort of urban setting. And that would have had a different set of resonances. But I think the casting of Charles Bronson leans into vigilantism, but then it asks you to question whether we should support his character or not. I think ultimately the film says, yeah, why not?
This is the story of a man who decided to clean up the most violent town in the world.
I said turn around. Hand me the money.
He begins where all the super cops leave off.
I think one of the pleasures we both had from rewatching it recently was how slow the burn is. That despite the fact that it's Charles Bronson and his persona, in fact, he's, you know, we're told literally he's a bleeding heart liberal. A little bit later, when he goes to Arizona, we get told that he was a conscientious objector in the Korean War, because his father was killed in a hunting accident, and he promised his mother he'd never shoot again, and basically is stuck with that because he loved his father. And again, it's a strong scene, actually. It's well done, because he's doing this at a shooting range, of course. And so the truth is that the film easily splits, so that in the opening part, they come back to New York quite quickly. You get the distressing violence of the attack on Bronson's wife and his daughter, which is shot for, you know, maximum impact, but at least is over reasonably quickly. We get Jeff Goldblum in a very early, I think more or less his first screen appearance, but we know he's a bad guy because he's making obscene gestures to Maria from Sesame Street. That's Gloria Manzano, who's playing the cashier in the supermarket. And then sprayed Nazi insignia, the swastika on the walls, attack the two women, and then run off. And he's devastated, and we get this interesting dialogue throughout the first 2/3 of the film between him and his his son-in-law, between Paul and his son-in-law, played by Stephen Keats. Because, of course, the wife is murdered, but the daughter is horribly traumatized and basically can't cope, can't come back from this horrible shock and experience that she's been through. But he then slowly starts to change, and you know he feels he has to protect himself initially, so that he gets a sort of, he gets a couple of dollars worth of change or whatever and puts it in a sock.
Yeah.
And then when this guy in the street comes up to him, he hits him with it. But you can see he's actually quite scared by the whole experience, and then he goes home and is quite upset about what's just happened.
Throws up, if I remember rightly.
No, that's after. Well, that's actually a little bit later. That's when he first shoots someone. But you know, he does something where he swings the sock around. It's this very striking image where he kind of swings it because he's so angry that it's come to this, if you like. But then, because he goes to Arizona and gets reintroduced to the idea of the pioneer spirit, gets given a gun by the character played by Stuart Margolin, who, of course, was just about to start playing Angel on the Rockford Files, a fantastic actor and director. And we slowly start to shift, but in actual fact, he doesn't, as it were, not to be crude about it, he doesn't shoot anybody until halfway through the film. It's a 93-minute movie, and I think 44 minutes in is when he shoots someone. And then he goes home and is horrified and throws up. And at which point we get the introduction of the cop, the character played by Vincent Gardenia. And it's at that point that, of course, the narrative strand splits, so that we get the investigation and we get to this situation where, of course, Paul is now deliberately going out. He has become a vigilante. And so I like the fact that it slowly builds, if you like. I think that's one of the things that makes the film have real merit, if you like, and also makes it more noirish, in that you get that it isn't that he's just pushed and pushed and pushed and he snaps. It's this horrible development. Like you say, it's in the book you've got this kind of nihilism, this kind of sense of despair about New York City in the 1970s. But here, something terrible has happened, and this has become his coping mechanism. If there's that fair?
And I think, well, I agree, because I don't want to get too down and just spend the whole time dissing the book, but it really is mean-spirited. In the book, he goes out and buys a gun, whereas in the film, he is given one by somebody. It's like temptation, right? Again, that's that noir element. He's heading down the wrong path, and then temptation is put in his way, and he, at that point, becomes powerless in a way to resist it. Whereas in the book, deciding to have a gun and shoot people is an act of will. He goes in to a shop in Arizona and buys it and brings it back on a plane. How funny is that? But and I think, again, that is what ties his character into this idea of a kind of noir male main character, flawed as an individual, acted upon by forces outside of their control, tempted, and breaks down. I mean, going back, because you mentioned the attack scene, which I think is worth kind of pausing on for a moment. It's a difficult kind of conversation to have, because in a way, there's no good reason to show these things anyway. There's no attack scene in the book. The book opens where he remembers where he was when he found out that his wife and daughter were attacked. So we do see it. But I suppose it's worth saying that particularly Death Wish 2, which had this unconscionable attack sequence at the beginning of it, which is really vile and unnecessary and reprehensible and not available in the UK at all. What struck me with watching this one is that it wasn't as protracted as I thought it was going to be. That it wasn't as explicit as I thought it was going to be. I don't necessarily want to say that that's to the film's credit, because I think, there's still a problem with the idea of including that in the first place. But I also think, from the perspective of someone, talking to people who may or may not have seen these films, may have an impression of these films as being ultra exploitative. What's interesting about the first one is that, I think that idea of the attack scenes being ultra exploitative comes from the second one and not from the first one.
Well, I think it reflects that ramping up of violence, depiction of violence, one should say, in the cinema that came from the end of the production code in 1967. Bonnie and Clyde, if you like, had lots of riddled bullets. But then, people tend to forget, but one of the things about even The Godfather and The Godfather Part 2 was the sense that they're incredible films, but they also have extreme violence in them. Sexual violence.
It's not extreme violence. That's the thing. It's violence. It's sexual violence.
But actually, yes,
it's not the same as what came later. And that is a poor defense, and it's not really a defense. But
no, I mean, and we're going to talk about the second one a little bit later on. But I think you're right. Is that there are films that you can refer to as exploitation movies, where it's about create a justification scenario, and therefore you make things as horrible as possible. But also, there's an element of titillation, which is sort of disturbing. Once you get past that, well, you've never seen this on the screen before, regular cinema, and then once you get past that, you're thinking, so why are you doing it? Whereas, as you say, you only see a certain amount here, and you probably see all you need to see. Yeah. The build-up is bigger, if you like. In the credits, of course, the three assailants is referred to as they're called freaks. That's literally, they don't have names. And I suppose, spoiler alert, but one of the things we certainly, and we'll talk about when we talk about the second one, is it's not a revenge film in the traditional sense, unlike, say, Taxi Driver, because we never see them again.
No.
And actually, without being too fancy-schmancy about it, it gives it a sort of artistic, critical credibility from that point of view, because Paul is not going out there trying to avenge what was done. He is just coping with how it makes him feel, how his own impotence in terms of violence, and which you explore through these dialogue scenes with his son-in-law, who there's that marvelous scene after he's gone out, and he's gone out at least a couple of times at this point, and he's now become comfortable with shooting people on the underground and so on and so forth. And he comes back, and because when he first goes back to the flat, you realise that he hasn't repainted, so that some of the horrible spray painting that was done by the people who did the home invasion, it's been smudged, but he hasn't even repainted the walls. But then the next time you go back to the flat, you see, oh no, there's paint cans out, and he's thinking about it. And then we cut to what turns out to be the final scene, in which we see the son-in-law. After this, we never see him again, in which he's had it all repainted. It's bright orange. He's got horrible 70s wallpaper. He's playing horrible kind of music on the soundtrack, which he wants at top volume, and that pushes the son-in-law almost further back. But the fact is that Paul is now at peace with himself. He's got horrible things. He's well aware of the terrible suffering of his daughter, because he sort of says, no, I went and saw her yesterday. I know how bad it is. But he's finally come to the point where, well, I'm doing something, and I'm feeling positive about it. But what I do also want to stress, which I think is worth talking about, is, because you alluded to it before, which is the big billboards, which we start getting at this point, where people walk past a billboard and it'll be Newsweek or some kind of publication where they're talking about vigilantism. And every time we go past one of these billboards, it's a different publication also talking about vigilance. And, it's over and over and over again. And the fact is that there is this satirical edge to it. That may have been in the original script by Wendell Mays, who was a very well-established writer, made, in fact, very interesting and provocative films in the past, including things like Anatomy of a Murder, for instance, which at the time was considered explicit for completely different reasons and sort of a naughty film, shall we say. But here we start getting that aspect of it, which perhaps belongs a little bit to Michael Winner. If you look at his films from the 60s, they were often comedies and had a kind of breezy quality to it, but also a kind of, sometimes a sad quality to them. Certainly films like The System, which to me is his best film, starring Oliver Reed. But also, I'll never forget What's His Name, or even Hannibal Brooks. They have a certain energy to it, but there is a kind of comic feel. And so we start getting these funny scenes, in terms of the way that the newspapers are covering the vigilantism, and you see Paul reading his own kind of articles about himself. And then we get these very funny sequences on the television where reporters are going out because now there's citizen vigilantism. They're covering, regular people who are going out and they're fighting back. It's almost Peter Finch from Network says, I'm mad and I can't take it anymore.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Network News Hour with Howard Beale.
I want all of you to get up out of your chairs. I want you to get up right now and go to the window, open it, and stick your head out and yell, I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore!
Except what's interesting is that you get the members of the public talking to the reporter about what they've done, and then when it cuts to him, the actual filmed sequence, which, so it's almost like it's a flashback, shall we say, and we see what really happened, which is often funnier or a lot more violent, but it's kind of played in a very light way, which is almost, and it is funny. And I think it is genuinely funny, but it's also satirical. It's a slightly distancing effect because it makes you think about, yeah, this is pretty stupid, actually. This is really bad because we've just seen him go away and blow some people away. And you can downplay that because you don't know anything about them. You just know that they're permanently angry. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? The muggers that he meets all seem to be very, very angry with all the people they meet. They're always kind of like, give me your money. And it's kind of like, why aren't you giving me your money? What's the matter with you? Give it to me now. And so they're as aggressive as possible, which is that to soften it? Is to make it easier for us to not mind so much that Paul is going around killing people just because he doesn't like them very much?
I think so. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. One of the key things about that scene you allude to where they interview the little old lady who fights back and stabs somebody with a pencil or something.
No, it's a hairpin. Hatpin. Sorry.
I was thinking of John Wick. Yeah.
The actions of the vigilante, as lawless as they may be, seem to be giving others new attitudes toward crime in the streets. Instead of helplessly allowing themselves to be mugged and robbed, a few are fighting back.
I have with me Mrs. Alma Lee Brown, who today successfully defended herself against 2 muggers with an unusual weapon. Mrs. Brown, would you tell us how you drove off your attackers today?
With a hat pin. You ever seen a hat pin?
I can't say that I have.
Well, that's what we used to hold our hats on with. And I ain't got no gun like this vigilante fella. But I went to my closet, and everybody better look out for me from now on. Because I've been robbed too many times, and I've got enough.
Some of the men who are building this skyscraper here made what you might call a citizen's arrest today. I'll ask Andrew McCabe, one of the foremen, to tell you about it.
Well, me and my crew was working down in the hole. Well, one of the boys up on the steel yelled down, hey, there's a mugging going on. So we come out of the hole and through the gate, and we caught this guy running, and we roughed him up a little bit before the police came.
Well, the hospital report says the man had 2 broken arms, a broken jaw, and cracked ribs.
No kidding. Geez, poor guy must have fell down.
One of the big problems with the film is that there is no kind of sense of empowerment, female empowerment in it at all. There are 2 women, one of them gets killed, the other becomes catatonic, and then the rest of the film, as you say, is about Paul coming to terms with what's happened to his wife and daughter. And
so the little old lady is the only empowered female in the whole film.
You do have this kind of moment where this little old lady kind of fights back with a hatpin, and it's tokenistic. And I mean, it's also tokenistic racially as well, because she's a woman of color. She fights back, and it's sort of basically saying, no, it's not just white guys kind of going out and shooting like Puerto Ricans or anything.
Well, there is that funny scene at the party, isn't there, where you get this woman who is just talking with someone at the party saying,
it's probably having as much effect on the total crime picture as putting a Band-Aid on a leopard.
Now, wait a minute. I don't know about that. I mean, a mugger's going to think twice about who he hits.
Sure, they're hitting more old ladies, that's all.
So, how you doing? Let me get you a drink.
I'll tell you one thing, the guy's a racist. You notice he kills more blacks than whites.
Oh, for Pete's sake, Harry, more blacks are muggers than whites. What do you want us to do, increase the proportion of white muggers who will have racial equality among muggers?
Oh, no. Racial equality among muggers? Oh, I love it.
He hasn't been since that terrible incident.
I mean, the film is aware.
Well, yeah, but you never know. That's the thing. You never know with Michael Winner whether he's aware but doesn't care, or whether he's aware and is sort of dropping that in, for a real purpose. Whether he's kind of saying, yeah, I can see how people would read this film as kind of racially problematic, but I
would argue, but that scene only serves that purpose.
Yeah,
that's the only thing that scene that it's a they had to hire that many extras and whatever just to do this party scene, That party scene tells you absolutely nothing except that you get to hear that person make that comment about him. And the fact that he's continuing, of course, his regular life with his colleagues. But that's the only bit of dialogue that you really catch that has any meaning. I think it's at best ambiguous, but I think that given, on the one hand, the perception that someone like Winner tended to be cynical in lots of ways, and certainly a lot of the films that he made in the 70s, even with very big stars, films like Scorpio, or Lawman, both of which with Burt Lancaster, for instance. They're very, very dark films. They have very, and sort of everybody dies type endings, that sort of thing. So you think, well, it's kind of a dark time in American cinema. These are big studio films. But the idea that they would just be depressing and so on and so forth, even within a genre like the spy thriller or a regular Western, somehow, no, that's just what people were responding to. Those were the times.
There's a great interview that he did. Barry Norman sent a reporter down to the set of Death Wish 3 to interview Michael Winner in 84, I suppose it must have been, film 85. Michael, and they raised the question, are you encouraging vigilantism with these films? And Winner is, by this point, he's kind of got his maximum haunt on. He's like, looks down on everybody. And he basically says, no, what I'm trying to do is to create or invent a scenario in which society has broken down to such an extent that this becomes a possibility. And to explore what happens when that scenario emerges. That struck me as quite interesting. It's somebody sort of not necessarily taking a moral stance on right or wrong, but sort of saying, okay, if we get to the point where people are going to do this, what does it mean?
And certainly one of the lasting, very strong things about the film, beyond its various sort of ethical implications, is that when you get to the finale of the film, on the one hand, you have Bronson attempt to sort of almost artificially create a kind of Western showdown, except he's been shot in the leg and he faints because he can't quite pull it off. And so, in fact, the guy he was chasing, one of the muggers in the latest killing spree of his, gets away. But then we get that fantastic scene. Well, it's just before it, but we get that terrific scene when the cop goes to see the DA and the police commissioner. And they say to him, we don't want him. We just want him out of New York because muggings are down by 50%, basically. They don't say it that way, but you look at the numbers, you're thinking, wow, they've halved in 1 week, basically. The muggers are scared. And we can't turn this guy into a hero. We can't turn him into a martyr either. So we're just going to make him somebody else's problem. I think it's very funny. I don't know if there's any ambivalence about it or ambiguity about it. I think the cop is kind of annoyed because he sort of says, he literally asks him to repeat it. He says, this is what you want me to do, right? I just want you to say it and I'll go and scare him off. Which of course he tries to do in various ways until finally we've got to the point where they've got the gun, they got him, in the scene, therefore he would just be going to jail forever. Or probably not. And that's the reality of it. He probably wouldn't go to jail for all that long.
Yeah.
But it's a perfect ending. Except it's not quite the ending. But that last scene, of course, is that between the policeman and him is, I think, very well judged.
Yeah, I agree. I agree, because it really does kind of get to the heart of the core issue of the film, which is what this guy is doing is having an impact, but you can't valorize him, you can't demonize him
for political reasons.
So what else can you do? Just send him to Chicago.
Send him to Chicago. Make it their problem.
Which he obviously doesn't. Where he obviously doesn't stay very long because he ends up in LA by the time you get to the second film.
So let's talk about the second one. We've teased.
Have to?
Well, only a little bit. In the second and final part of my conversation with Simon Brown about the Death Wish films, we'll consider the original and the first 2 sequels and try and put all 3 of them in their proper historical and cinematic context. You have been listening to Tipping My Fedora, the show about all things noir. It is produced for Castiglione Publishing by me, Sergio Angelini, and our theme tune is by Petar Milinkovic, whose work is available through Tailkeeper Music. All audio clips are the copyright of their respective owners, and used under fair dealing and fair use exceptions solely for the purposes of criticism and review. Please subscribe to Tipping My Fedora wherever you get your podcast fix, and it would be great if you could leave ratings and reviews about the show at Apple Podcasts. Be seeing you.